And if I were to ask you, what is higher education, what is the function of it? My feeling is I would get a different answer from everybody in the room. Some of you would say it's about competence development, some of you would say it's about employability, some of you would say it's about safeguarding knowledge, some of you would give me all sorts of other answers. And the truth is that there are so many different answers that it's actually very, very difficult to think of higher education truly as a unitary body. We always talk about higher education as this general thing, and we know all the functions. But if we break it down, it becomes very different. For example, look at these three professions. Medicine, it's something that trains you for a very, very specific profession. You're being trained for a specific job. Literature, you're being given a set of skills, a set of knowledge, which doesn't necessarily have a job. It's a completely different type of experience. Languages quite often go as an assist to other types of courses. Let's look at it from a facilities perspective. A university will have startup centers whose only job is to create businesses and launch them on the market. It will have lecture halls, which are for lessons like this. It will have research labs whose function is to create new knowledge. So if you really think about this, you say, how can you describe all of this as one thing under the level of higher education? They're really very, very different functions. And what I'd like to talk about today is one of the many distinctions you can have. And it's the distinction of academic education versus professional education. And when we're talking about professional education, we're talking about it in terms of this definition, which says that professional higher education is one that offers a particularly intense integration with the world of work at all levels of the EQF from 6 and above. Basically, we're talking about professional bachelors, professional masters, professional doctorates. Now, first of all, what is professional higher education not? When we're talking about professional higher education, we are not talking about education that is coming from universities of applied sciences or vocational universities or so on. We're also not talking about vocational education and training. What we're talking about is any type of higher education that is oriented towards professions, which means, absolutely, a university of applied science, most of what it provides, probably will be professional higher education. But engineering and medicine and architecture, these are also professional qualifications being offered under a normal university. So we're not really talking about the type of institution that offers it, we're talking about the type of education and what the features of that education are. Now, if we think, what is education for? We have requirements that come from different sources. So if you're the institution and saying, what am I supposed to do? You have three sources. First of all, legal and regulatory. What NACFIS or the government or so on and so forth ask you to do. Secondly, you have your customer focus or your learner requirements. What are your students asking of you? What are they asking you to provide? And thirdly, the tricky one, you have a whole ecosystem of community expectations. And that community is actually quite a few different types of people. First of all, it's the academic community, what your peers are expecting of you in terms of publication and in terms of participation in conferences and so on and so forth. What is the wider society expecting of you? What is the community where the university is based expecting? What type of research is going to contribute to the company and so on and so forth? And also, very, very importantly, what is the world of work expecting in terms of employability? And when we talk about the world of work, we're not just talking about companies, we're not just talking about enterprises, we're also talking about civil society organizations and NGOs. We're also talking about the public sector, which in the end is the biggest employer of them all. And when we're thinking about professional higher education is that segment that really is focused towards the needs of these three actors. So if we think about what type of requirements they might ask for from professional higher education, we might say that they're asking for diversification of learning opportunities. We might say that they're asking for an institution to offer qualifications. We might say it's looking for a stimulation of innovation. Or maybe it's just looking for a different teaching style, one that is much more focused on application, on practice-based training and these types of techniques. If we look at requirements, and if we look at how do we check that these requirements are actually being achieved, that is the area for quality assurance. That's the area for quality checks. And so if we're thinking of different sources of requirements, in the same way, we also have different sources of quality criteria. Here you have those that come from regulators and governments. These are simple enough. They're usually determined by experts. They're usually there to protect the consumer, protect society generally, and anybody who's in the business essentially has to go with them whether they like it or not. And I mean, typical types of procedures here are what we would call accreditation procedures or external quality assurance procedures. The second type is the requirements that come from the higher education institution, or rather from the stakeholders within it. In other words, from your own staff, from your own students. These are often coming from constant iterative feedback loops, from surveys, from an understanding of the needs and the quality expectations of the people inside the institution. And in terms of quality tools, the way we usually see that instrumentalized in terms of tools like internal quality manuals, internal self-assessment cycles, and so on and so forth. What about the expectations of the community? Now, for the expectations of the stakeholder community, we also have a set of tools, and the tools we have are usually what we call quality labels. And quality labels are usually quality tools which focus on a specific expectation, a specific understanding, and are usually formed from a consensus created by a specific stakeholder community. I'll give you some examples. There are many, many, many different types of quality labels. The first are the subject-specific ones. Most of you have heard of the AACSB or the EQUIS for business schools. There's ECARTS for arts faculties, EURACE for engineering. And all of these were created by the community of business schools or the community of art schools to understand what are our consensus quality criteria as a community. You then have another set of ones which focus on modes of provision, things like e-learning or distance learning or MOOCs. And all of these, again, were created by the members of those communities saying our understanding of quality e-learning or our understanding of quality distance learning or quality MOOC is X. The third part, and maybe the most interesting, is labels that look at specific aspects of higher education. Examples of that are the Pascal guidelines, which look at how student-centered an institution is. You have the Guardian Diversity Awards, which are looking at diversity policies and rating the diversity policies of different institutions. And you have the ASHA, I think I said that right, which is looking at sustainability policies for universities. And each of these is a quality matrix you can check and check your institution against it if diversity or sustainability or student-centered learning is important to your institution. So at our project, which is called Strengthening the Quality of Professional Enhanced Education, we asked ourselves, do we currently measure the quality of the professional element of higher education? It seems to us that this is an important question. I mean, universities only have the job to provide all the graduates needed for the knowledge economy. So it seemed to us that it would be rather sensible to actually check if they're doing that job well. So what we did was we did a gap analysis and we checked 22 different quality labels across Europe to see what emphasis was given to professional higher education in them. The short answer is that while most of them mentioned it in some way or another, none of them really made it a strong focus. And with most of them, you could get away, you could pass the quality label without necessarily having a strong focus on professional higher education. So what we concluded from that is that there probably is a clear need for professional higher education specific quality tools. Because if you as an institution say, listen, I want to check specifically how good my professional preparation is, I specifically want to improve in that area because I feel I'm not professionally oriented enough, there's no tool which you can say, this is the tool for you, follow this set of guidelines, and in 2 or 3 years after following it, you'll be there. That tool doesn't exist at the moment. So this was our starting point of trying to move forward to create something in terms of a quality tool for this. If we're going to think, what is, at a very, very high level, the measurement of quality you could use to measure this professional element, if you had only to choose one indicator? And actually, the definition of professional higher education gives it to you, because it says that it is one that has a particularly intense integration with the world of work. So if we go by that definition, you might say that PhD quality is directly proportional to the intensity of that integration. This again, looking at it at a very, very high level. What would that mean? We found that some research had been done on this, and this is basically a model for measuring intensity of integration with the world of work at different levels. Here is where you would have the formation of a relationship, and what it describes, it's saying, listen, the relationship will be initial contact, it will only be working together on short projects, it will likely involve an individual, one professor, one person from a department, and that would be the formation of a relationship. On the other hand, all the way on the other side is what we would call a strategic partnership, the highest level of integration. And there you would have several activities running simultaneously. They would be running for the long term. They would be running at a much higher level, working with the university management and the entire organization. And that is what we would say would be a more intense relationship. It's fine to say we have intense relationships, but the question is, what should you do with them specifically? Where would they be useful to actually give some benefit to your students? And that's where the work which we did in our projects came in. Now, the point of this slide is just to tell you that there is a lot of European movement going behind this idea of quality for professional higher education. So the group that has been working on this has been working on it now for 3 years. We've consulted over 1,000 actors in pretty much every EU country. There are 15 partners working on it. We've gone through nearly €1 million of EU funding. So it's something that has really been gaining some movement, been gaining some attention. And the three areas for quality we figured out are the policy and strategy of the institution, the teaching and learning policies of the institution, and its research activities. And the very high-level questions we're asking ourselves are, how is professional higher education embedded and represented in those policies? We're asking, how is teaching and learning influenced by the professional element? So if you're giving a professional course, how does it change the teaching and learning? And how is research integrated with this idea of professional higher education? To do that, we've come up with a set of quality criteria. There are 10 of them in all, and we're looking at policy and strategy integration, the objectives and outcomes of the higher education. We're looking at curriculum development, learning methodology, content, research agenda, research process. There's a whole list of them. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to walk you through each one of them for the next 20 minutes. You can download the document for that. But just to give you an idea how we've developed the criteria framework. So each of these we call a criterion or an indicator. And each one of those we've then described in terms of 3 descriptors. First is the description. It just explains what we mean by that indicator. Then we've set what we call a core criterion. The core criterion is the bare minimum we would consider that education has to meet to be considered professional higher education. It is not saying a bare minimum for quality. It's saying a bare minimum for quality professional education. And then we also have a set of characteristics of excellence. So once we've defined the minimum, we're also saying these are ideas. If you're doing these, maybe you're closer to the maximum. I'll give you just one example with one of the criteria. This is the criterion on policy and strategy integration. So we say that integration of the world of work into policies and strategic framework. That's what we mean by it. Let's see what the bare minimum policy is for you to be professional education. Your policies and strategies have to be defined in collaboration with the world of work. Now, what we're saying is, listen, it's not enough to consult the world of work, you have to collaborate with them. If the strategies are not done through collaboration, then you're taking it into account, but academic higher education does exactly the same thing. It takes it into account. You're not professional unless you're doing it in true collaboration. You're just in a different category. But then, what are the characteristics of excellence? And then we're seeing cooperation with professional regulatory bodies, structural involvement with the world of work, active and long-term engagement, supportive of research and innovation. And you see that these are then much more in-depth types of collaboration. And for each of those 10, we've developed these criteria. If you want to download them, that's the link. I'll make the presentation available afterwards. But then the question is, once you have a whole set of criteria, what do you do with them? It's all very good to write the report. How do you implement them? And from our understanding, we have imagined 3 scenarios that institutions might want to use these. Now, first of all, we're figuring that some institutions might want to use them to check the quality of their professional element. And other institutions might say, we want to professionalize further and we want to increase the professional element. Either way, the criteria help. And the first use is simple, using as a guidance for practice. We have best practice examples associated with all of these, and institutions might just want to read them and use them for inspiration, the end. If they do, we're thrilled. The second and more in-depth involvement with it is integrating it into internal quality assurance. Looking at your internal quality manual, looking at your internal procedures and saying, which of these are we missing? Which elements of professional higher education quality assurance are not already included? And possibly integrating them within the quality assurance. We release everything under open source licenses because we want institutions to use them, to copy them, to modify them, to integrate them. And then for institutions that take this really seriously and want to go a further step up, we've also been considering the concept of creating external excellence evaluations, or essentially having external quality reviews focused specifically on the professional element. Where are we with that at the moment? This is the general project plan, which we are about halfway through at the moment. We've defined quality criteria for PHE, and at the moment we're testing the validity of the quality criteria. So those quality criteria I showed you are downloadable off our website. They're already the 3rd version, I believe. But we also have a survey accompanying them, and we're asking stakeholders for feedback on how we can improve them. In particular, how we can further refine the characteristics of excellence. At the same time, we've been determining methods of testing and running pilots. And what we're doing is we're identifying certain institutions who are willing to volunteer, and we're trying to run traditional quality assurance type external reviews in those institutions to check their professional element. Once we take all the feedback from that, we will be designing a service model to turn this into a service that can be offered for the months and years to come at the end of the project. Always assuming we get good feedback from the institutions, always assuming they tell us this was something useful, this is something we would like to do again. Because if the institutions tell us a nice idea, but it wasn't really useful, then it was an experiment which failed, nothing wrong with that, and we close it down. A slide on more information. The PHXL website has a host of information on it. I told you that we did the gap analysis of 22 different quality systems. You will find detailed descriptions of every one of those quality systems. We mapped them against each criteria of the European standards and guidelines individually. You will find all the raw data from our surveys, all our publications, the consultation documents. There's a very, very large information source, all available for free for anybody who wants to research this further. And finally, I'd just like to leave you with a thought. And that is that the future is too important to just let it happen. Universities are entrusted with training the next generation in many areas, but one of them is they're entrusted with training the workforce for tomorrow to create a new knowledge-based society. It's too important to just assume it will happen if we give our lectures right. We have to make sure that we're really preparing them for professions, and that's what we hope to do with this project. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your attention.